Hey guys, it's me, EODGamer here, and today I have a really fun one. I'm going to be sharing with you the best elements currently and how I think the meta will shift and how that implicates building strategies and what characters you want to focus on for certain type of content as well. I have it split here by boss, elite, normal. If any of you who are listening to this in the background, don't worry about the charts on screen. My narration pretty will be enough and all that you need really. But first things first, let's talk about what we see on screen. You know we don't waste any time on this channel, so I always like to jump in with the most important thing, and that's why I put this slide first. Influencers. What influences a classification? Let's say I want to see normal monsters. What is the highest likelihood of their weakness appearing? From what we have in the current game, the elements that are most common is number 1 for normal monsters, physical, ice, wind. The one that is least common is typing like fire and imaginary. Why does this make a difference is because if you think about small monsters, these are monsters that likely will appear a lot in the pure fiction event game mode, and that is why a character like Argenti is so meta, because everything is more or less weak to physical. The chance of them being weak to physical is also one of the highest based on the current pool of characters or monsters that we have in the game. Ice, Herta, very strong as well. Tons of monsters weak to ice. What I was very interested to see is that normal monsters are actually not too very weak to fire, which is maybe an upside in the future. If more fire comes into the game, maybe Himiko might do a lot better. Maybe characters like Gallagher might do a lot better as well. Or anyone with AoE fire could see a huge uptrend. Of course, then we shift aside. Instead of going to elites and boss minions, which are the abundant deer twigs and Fantalia flowers and stuff, let's look at the fun one, which is really bosses. This is where it's really interesting, because imaginary, the chance of the boss being weak to imaginary in the game is extremely high. A lot of them are weak to imaginary, and if we use this data that we have, historic data, and we plot for future monsters that are coming out into the game according to the same trend, if Hoyoverse doesn't make any changes, the probability of a new monster being weak to imaginary is very high, unless they want to switch it up, maybe increase a bit more ice weakness enemies, increase a bit more physical weakness enemies. But you will see later a lot of bosses are weak to imaginary. It's just crazy how many they are, which definitely affects things, which is why Doctor ratio is very strong, which is why in Bibital Lune you will find that you hit a lot of enemy with imaginary weaknesses. Is there a pro? Is there a con? They are definitely very usable now in the current meta, but whether Hoyoverse decides to change the trend is besides the analysis for now. We are just looking at what is the landscape here already. And I'm just going to show you real quick, for example, the elite category. Ice is again very high up on the list in terms of enemies that are weak to ice. Imagery is not too far behind. Quantum, physical, one of the last few, but this is the spread that we have. And of course, boss minions here, which are the monsters that are summoned by the boss. Savarok's arm, abundant deer twigs, Fantalia flowers, and etc. Fire is good against these kind of bosses. Imaginary, again, is also very strong. So if you are struggling in a certain type of content, this is where this video is definitely going to be quite helpful and showing you what could be done. But talking about all these influences is nice. Let's look at another thing, which is really the monster weakness category. Let's look at the left one first. The right one is a little bit complicated, and I know some of you folks are colorblind, which is why I try to make the color scheme as close in game as possible. But not to worry, let me narrate what the boxes are. It will always be in the same order. The first one is fire in red. We have imaginary, followed by ice, lightning, physical, quantum, and wind. And that's the colors for any of you colorblind folks. Try to match the Honkai Star Rail colors as much as I can to help out a little bit as well. So first things first, don't worry about this bar and stuff like that. I'm just counting here the number of weakness enemies that are weak to a particular element. It doesn't mean that there are 42 mobs in the game for bosses, it's just the count of how many weaknesses there are. By and large, you can see here, if you look at the boss category, a lot of enemy bosses are weak to imaginary. Really a huge amount. We can zoom in later on. But I can also show you elite, imaginary is not too far behind, second place. Boss minions, they are also behind, not too far behind, second place. Normal monsters is where imaginary falls short a little bit. They are not super strong. But then again, I will argue that normal category, the normal monsters, are the most squishiest, and also at the same time the one that weakness matters more or less the least, because you can pretty much hard force your way bunga through them. But two other observations that I have is quantum is extremely low on every single category. It's almost the last in almost every single thing. Normal monsters is the last amount of enemies weak to quantum. Boss minions, it's like lower middle of the pack. Elite monsters is the last, and boss monsters is only just slightly ahead of the last place, which is ice, and that is very interesting to note. Why do I think so? I think there is a reason for this. It's because they want to sell Silverwolf, who is able to drop in weaknesses in enemies, and Quantum here, of course, is Silverwolf's main element. They want to try to encourage more people to play mono Quantum teams with Silverwolf. It just like makes no sense to have every monster weak to Quantum, and then Silverwolf has no value. You can't make money out of it from Hoyover's perspective. So that's one of the angles that I think of. Other than that, I think there could be a lot more upside for fire to improve. In the normal mode, there are very low amounts of enemies that are weak to fire in the normal mode. For a AoE bursting, break effect bursting class, which really double down on that, which maybe could be upside to Himiko as well as Gallagher in future. But this is the current trend. The characters definitely that are favored right now are imaginary characters without a doubt. They are just very strong across all single monster categories too. So looking at all that stats is really nice, but I think more importantly is what is the practical implications of the data that we're seeing? How does it affect what we want to build? If you think about it, if you are addressing hard content in the game, there are always going to be 3 weaknesses on the enemy boss or elite monsters that are in the game currently. What that means is there are 7 elements in the game. If you are a new player, don't struggle to build all elemental DPS. What you want to do is focus on the ones that are majority, the most popular elements, and you can pretty much like neglect 2 elements and not build for them at all, and you will always be able to tackle any single content in the game. That brings down the resource requirement of pulling limited characters down by a lot. Based on what we see here, you might think ice is like the easiest to give up, but actually ice is very strong against elite monsters as well. So probably a smaller like set. For example, Quantum is one of the lower ones if you combine both of them together. Wind is also not very common. Physical is also not very common. The others are more popular. And that's like some things that you can take away. These are some examples of how these data can actually help us. Very interesting that there's quite a bit of monsters already with 2 weaknesses only. And we might be able to like see, for example, more in future. Maybe one day we'll have a 2 weakness boss, 2 weakness elite monster. That is going to be when it's going to be a lot more tougher because you need more characters to deal with the same amount of content. This of course means that characters like Xue, characters like Acheron, characters like Silverwolf, who bypass these weaknesses elements, are really kings and queens of this domain because it helps you increase your account efficiency by tons. You don't care what these weaknesses are, you just break every single thing as well. Especially if you're playing like break teams, break effect teams, you want to like gear off towards there. This is going to be very useful because you want to know exactly what are you hitting. So next up, I have here, don't worry about all these like complicated charts and blah blah blah. What I'm doing here is I actually just want to see a graphic of every single monster because like I mentioned, the count of the number of weaknesses is interesting. But for example, let me narrow it down to just the boss monsters alone, and I apologize for any colorblind folks out there who can't differentiate the numbers. I promise that my narration will be good enough for you to get a lot of value out of this as well. So what I have here is I'm splitting up basically on the x-axis the different bosses in the game currently as of time of recording, and over here I just have the weaknesses in different colors. What I want you to notice is this color over here, this is like imaginary color. For any of you colorblind folks who just see like in grayscale or something like that, I want you to notice like I'm going to move my cursor to help out also. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 as we saw. 9 of these elements are weak. Bosses are weak to imaginary, and Cocolio I will argue is like sometimes you could consider as the same monster, so you have even lesser enemies that are like not weak to imaginary. Argenti, Abundant Deer, Cocolia, and Svarog are the only characters not weak to imaginary, and I will argue that most of these, like Saber and Cocolia, are very early game. Tripping on my words here because I'm just shocked how many monsters are weak to imaginary. But yeah, these are very early game characters or enemies that hardly appear nowadays. Abundant Deer also hardly appears. So the only character that you'll probably see in the rotations nowadays is like Argenti, maybe some extent like Deer, but Imaginary pretty much tackles any single thing. That's why Dr. Ratio is so good. They released Dr. Ratio and then they made him super useful because of the amount of boss content you can tackle. I think that's a really, really nice thing to have. So you can see the split. For any of you who want to know like other things to build, if you don't have Imaginary, if you notice here, the bosses that are not weak to Imaginary are actually weak to fire. Sabaro is weak to fire, Bronya is weak to fire, Cocolia is weak to fire, Argenti and Deer are all weak to fire. This is why a team of Topaz and Nambi and Dr. Ratio is very strong, because you can tackle any boss in the game. If you look at this bottom row, you can see it very clearly. you pretty much tackle every single thing, and you can like double down on certain ones like Bronyer, as well as the Memory Zone meme, something on to death. So that's like one analysis that we have. And so far, if you're finding value in this content, do give me a like, comment what more do you hope to see, or if it's really useful for you. I try to do like things a little bit different as well, because I want to add more value into this community based on what we are seeing too. And again, huge shout out to Howl99 and Chnono for helping collate all these data. It's very, very useful. But this analysis, of course, done by us on my own as well. So now, more interestingly, let's split up into the normal monsters. Of course, this is going to be like a huge chunk of like, you can't even see the text at the bottom here. But more importantly, I think is the trend and what we see. And what I want to say is just, it's split all over the place. If you are looking for a particular element to tackle monsters, there is no king. Everyone has like certain weaknesses and stuff like that. So there's no need to like snipe certain elements for normal monsters, which makes erudition characters a bit more trickier to pick as well, because the amount of monsters that you can face is so varied. There's no clear winner in the normal category, and that's one of the things that I noticed as well, which is why erudition characters is very, very you have a lot of rotations in the pure fiction eventually when the weaknesses of enemies start rotating around, and you can always have like enemies with multiple weaknesses that don't match each other, so you need to bring like multiple erudition characters to tackle just one flaw, for example. Last in this chart at least, I will talk about elite monsters and whether we see any trend. If you follow the imaginary and fire rule to tackle major monsters, you will see on this bottom row, this is fire, imaginary weakness, fire weakness. Only one here, the Blaze Out of Space, is not weak to fire, imaginary. You have Decaying Shadow here is weak to fire. You have, again here, imaginary fire weakness. Your Guardian Shadow is not weak to imaginary or fire, but pretty much almost every other thing, like except the Silver Main Lieutenant and the Ascended is also not weak to imaginary or fire, but everything else weak to imaginary and fire. So please, if you have Doctor Ratio, you are tackling a lot of things, consider building fire. It will be a very, very nice pair to go along with him, and you can tackle pretty much most hard content in the game. I think that's one of the major takeaways here. Other than that, Wind also seems to tackle a bit over here. I see on the top row here, there's quite a number of Wind icons, but there's nothing as nice as this like red and yellow imaginary and fire synergy that we can see going on here. So all of this information, all this data, very nice, but at the end of the day, let's talk about it. Who are the characters that we want to build if we want to make use of this, what we see here in terms of the boss minion elites having a lot of fire and imaginary weakness. So I'm going to just select, for example, 5 imaginary characters. These are the characters that we have in the game, of course. I might not have changed some of the names yet, so as of time of recording, but anyways, let me go with offensive characters. Let's look at Destruction, Nihility, Hunt, and Erudition. So 4, I would say these are like the more damaging classes. I will assume Abundance, Harmony, and Preservation are not part of this list. Of course, you have Gallagher, which is considered offensive as well. But for the sake of demonstration, I will not talk about him. And for example, okay, maybe let me just include them, because we technically have Aventurine and Gallagher who are offensive units, and I'll just include them in. So these are the characters that we have. If I sort them out by stat efficiency here, and if you are wondering like what all these data is, we talk about it a lot on this channel. Check out our other videos if you are interested in how we calculate these data. I assume that some of you already know, but don't worry, even if you don't know, it doesn't really add. It just helps me filter up in terms of the stat efficiency overall. Doctor Ratio here. If you have Doctor Ratio, you pretty much already tackle a lot of the imaginary content. So the one that you're probably looking for likely will be Fire elemental characters, which are likely going to be these characters that are helping you deal damage. If you find that you need more single target damage, you could consider Topaz and Nambi, combos very well with Doctor Ratio. Hook is also really strong. Hook is also single target, but very, very slow. There's a lot of problems with it. If you are maybe wanting to play like other characters, you have your Gallbladder here, Gallbladder here, or your Gallagher. In the past, we used to just use this placeholder name. Great Knife and Himiko, all very, very popular choices, depending on what you're looking for as well, for the fire aspect. Trailblazer Preservation is a bit, in my opinion, not that great because you can't solo sustain unless you bring on another healer, which really lowers your DPS by a lot when you bring 2 sustain characters in. I would consider going for, like, if you wanted a sustain in this category, go for a Gallagher. You probably will be able to self-sustain, as we will be checking out tomorrow when the game goes live as well. You can check out our channel for more information. And if you found this video helpful so far, do give it a like, subscribe for more such future content. And if you like such data content, check out the other 2 guides that I'll link over here. One of them talks about these character splits and what are actually efficient characters in the game. And other than that, I'll talk about some relics that are very, very useful on the right hand side here. And guys, thank you so much for watching. See you next video.